Miss Marple Murder at the knitting competition. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I want to begin by saying how truly grateful I am for each of you who chooses to spend your time here. It warms my heart to know that these stories bring comfort and joy to such a wonderful community of listeners. Preparing every mystery takes time and care, but seeing how much you enjoy them makes it all worthwhile. It means the world to me that our little community continues to grow, and I'm delighted that so many of you are part of it. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more stories to enjoy together. Chapter 1. Bells. Cakes and a cup the St. Mary. Me assembly rooms had never looked more festive. Miss Jane Marple reflected as she stepped through the heavy oak doors on that crisp February morning. Bunting in cheerful red and white stretched across the high ceiling, and the familiar scent of beeswax polish mingled with the more enticing aromas of fresh-baked Victoria sponges and jam tarts arranged on the refreshment tables. The annual winter fair and knitting cup competition was one of the village's most anticipated events, and judging by the bustling crowd already gathering, this year would prove no exception. Ladies in their best coats moved purposefully between the various displays, their voices creating a pleasant hum of excitement and anticipation. Jane, how lovely to see you here so early, Lady Bantry, resplendent in a new emerald coat that brought out her eyes, approached with her characteristic warm smile. I do hope you've entered something in the competition this year. Miss Marple adjusted her neat gray gloves and smiled back at her dear friend. I'm afraid my poor efforts hardly compare to the beautiful work on display here, Dolly, but I wouldn't miss the judging for the world. Indeed, the entries were quite spectacular. Delicate lace shawls stretched on wooden blocking boards lined one wall, their intricate patterns catching the light that streamed through the tall windows. On the raised platform at the far end of the room, several chairs had been arranged for the speed knitting heats, needles and balls of wool at the ready. But it was the heritage corner that drew Miss Marple's particular attention. In the far corner, beside a display of antique knitting needles and pattern books, stood a beautiful old spinning wheel. The rich patina of well-cared-for wood gleamed under the electric lights, and every brass fitting sparkled with recent polishing. That's Mrs. Carr's pride and joy, Dolly observed, following Miss Marple's gaze. She's brought it specially for the demonstration this afternoon. It's a genuine Saxony wheel, you know. Her grandmother's, I believe, Mrs. Lena Carr, a gentlewoman in her middle years, was indeed hovering anxiously near the wheel, making small adjustments to its position and checking that the drive belt hung properly. She caught sight of Miss Marple's interested expression and smiled shyly. It still spins beautifully after all these years, she said, running her fingers lovingly along the smooth wood of the drive wheel. I do hope people will enjoy seeing the old ways demonstrated. I'm certain they will, my dear, Miss Marple assured her. There's something rather soothing about the old crafts, isn't there? Such a connection to the past. The morning progressed with the pleasant rhythm of a well-organized village event. Mrs. Hilda Jackson, the brisk and efficient secretary of the Women's Institute, moved between the various attractions with her clipboard and official badges, ensuring everything ran according to schedule. Her husband Ernie had positioned himself near the raffle table, where a large wicker hamper filled with donated goods awaited the afternoon drawing. Hilda's got everything organized down to the last minute, Dolly murmured admiringly. I don't know how she manages it all, Miss Marple nodded, though she couldn't help noticing the slight strain around Mrs. Jackson's eyes as she consulted her watch for what seemed like the 10th time in as many minutes. Organization was all very well, but sometimes it could become rather a burden. The morning's activities proceeded smoothly. The Reverend Leonard Clement had opened the fair with a brief blessing, his wife Griselda adding her own cheerful welcome. Dr. Haddock had made his customary round, sampling the cakes with professional thoroughness before declaring them all perfectly wholesome. Even Inspector Slack had appeared, looking somewhat out of place among the displays of domestic artistry, but clearly enjoying Mrs. Pottle's shortbread. Agnes Pottle herself was holding court near her prize-winning entries, a selection of intricate, Fair Isle jumpers that had taken her the better part of a year to complete. She was, Miss Marple knew, the village's acknowledged champion knitter, and her rivalry with some of the county ladies who entered the competition was legendary. "Mark my words," Mrs. Pottle was saying to a small group of admirers. "These county people think they know everything about proper technique. But there's nothing that beats village training. We learn properly, we do. Not like some I could mention who think fancy wool makes up for poor tension." It was at this moment that Mrs. Millicent Armitage made her entrance. The county judge of the Knitting Cup was an imposing woman in her late 50s, tall and angular, with steel-gray hair arranged in perfect waves and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She wore an expensive navy coat and draped elegantly around her neck, a beautiful long silk scarf in shades of cream and gold that fluttered gracefully as she moved. "Good morning, everyone," she announced in clear, carrying tones. "I trust we're all prepared for a morning of proper assessment and fair judging." Mrs. Jackson hurried forward with visible relief. "Mrs. Armitage, how wonderful that you're here early. Perhaps you'd like to begin your examination of the entries. I've arranged everything according to categories just as you specified." "Excellent." Mrs. Armitage's gaze swept the room with professional assessment. "I see we have quite a good showing this year. Now, I trust everyone understands that the judging will be conducted according to proper standards. Technique, consistency, and attention to detail will be paramount." She moved among the displays with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority, pausing here and there to examine stitches more closely, occasionally making notes on a small pad she carried. Miss Marple watched with interest as Agnes Pottle's jaw tightened slightly when Mrs. Armitage spent considerably less time examining her entries than some of the others. The morning's judging proceeded without incident, though Miss Marple couldn't help noticing the subtle tensions that ran beneath the surface of polite conversation. Competition, even in such genteel circumstances, had a way of bringing out people's true characters. At precisely 11:30, Mrs. Jackson rang a small silver handbell to call attention to the platform. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to begin our speed knitting demonstration, followed by Mrs. Carr's presentation of traditional spinning techniques. If you'd like to gather around the Heritage Corner, please do so now." The crowd began to move toward the spinning wheel, chatting excitedly. Mrs. Armitage, who'd been examining the final entries with methodical precision, glanced at her small row counter, a neat little device clipped to her knitting needle that showed the number 9, and smiled slightly. "One more row to finish," she murmured to herself, a habit Miss Marple had noticed earlier, "and then we shall see the old arts properly demonstrated." She moved gracefully through the crowd, her silk scarf trailing elegantly behind her, and positioned herself near the spinning wheel where Mrs. Carr waited nervously, hands fluttering over the familiar controls. "Now then," Mrs. Armitage said in her clear, authoritative voice, "let us show these young people how things were done when craftsmanship truly mattered. It was then that everything went so terribly wrong." Chapter 2. The Judge at the Wheel, the Key. Silence that followed was profound and terrible. For a moment, the assembled crowd seemed frozen in tableau, as if someone had cast a spell over the entire assembly rooms. Then, quite suddenly, everyone began speaking at once. "Get the belt off." Dr. Haddock's voice cut through the confusion as he pushed his way forward, but Mrs. Carr had already stamped down hard on the wooden treadle, bringing the great wheel to a shuddering halt. Too late. Mrs. Millicent Armitage lay crumpled beside the spinning wheel, her silk scarf wound tight about her throat, the beautiful cream and gold fabric now bearing witness to a tragedy that had unfolded in mere seconds. Inspector Slack, who had been sampling the refreshments with considerable dedication, arrived at the scene with uncharacteristic speed, his face grim as he took in the situation. "Nobody move," he commanded, though several people were already clustered around the still form. "Dr. Haddock, is she—" The doctor looked up from where he knelt beside Mrs. Armitage, his expression grave. "Asphyxia. Death would have been swift at least." Mrs. Carr had sunk into a chair, trembling violently, her hands pressed to her mouth in horror. "I don't understand," she kept repeating. "I don't understand how it could have happened." The wheel was set so gently, so very gently. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself slightly apart from the immediate crowd, watched the scene with quiet attention. While others exclaimed and theorized, she found herself drawn to the mechanical details of the tragedy. Lady Bantry appeared at her elbow, her face pale. "Jane, how absolutely dreadful, that poor woman. What a ghastly accident." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, though her tone suggested she was considering the matter carefully. "Quite ghastly." Agnes Pottle, who had pushed her way to the front of the crowd, was less restrained in her commentary. "I'm not surprised," she declared with characteristic bluntness. "County people always thinking they know better than village folk, flinging scarves about near machinery like that. It's asking for trouble, that's what it is." Her words drew sharp looks from several of the other ladies present. But Mrs. Pottle appeared quite unrepentant. "Well, it's true enough. Mrs. Carr knows that wheel like the back of her hand. She'd have warned anyone who'd listen about proper safety." Mrs. Carr looked up through her tears. "But I had said it so carefully," she protested. The double drive was quite slack, and the Scotch tension was almost completely off. It shouldn't have had any real pull at all. "Well, certainly not enough to—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood what she meant. The wheel, as she had prepared it for demonstration, should have been as gentle as a lamb. Inspector Slack was methodically questioning everyone about what they had witnessed, though the answers seemed frustratingly similar. Mrs. Armitage had approached the wheel, made her comment about showing the old arts, leaned in to observe more closely, and somehow her trailing scarf had caught in the mechanism. The wheel's momentum had done the rest. "A matter of seconds," confirmed the Reverend Clement, who had been standing quite near. One moment she was speaking. The next, Mrs. Jackson, though visibly shaken, was maintaining her organizational composure with admirable determination. "5 minutes only," she announced to the crowd. 5 minutes to tidy the corner properly, and then we must allow the authorities to conduct their investigation without interference. Miss Marple found this announcement rather interesting. In her experience, the immediate aftermath of such events was often when the most telling details could be observed, before well-meaning people began to tidy things away. She moved closer to the spinning wheel, careful not to interfere with Dr. Haddock's examination of the deceased. The mechanism itself was indeed beautiful, a testament to the craftsman who had built it decades ago. Every component showed the careful maintenance that Mrs. Carr had lavished upon her grandmother's treasure. But as Miss Marple examined the wheel more closely, 3 small details caught her attention: the brake band that ran around the flyer, the part of the wheel that would control how tightly the mechanism gripped the thread, looked somehow different from what she might have expected. It appeared oddly slick and translucent, not at all like the cotton twine that one would normally use for such a purpose. Then there was one of the flyer hooks, the small metal guides that helped direct the thread onto the bobbin. It seemed to be positioned incorrectly, turned against what she understood to be the proper direction. Finally, she noticed a faint, clear glossiness on the Scotch tension knob, the adjustment that Mrs. Carr had claimed to have set so loosely. It reminded Miss Marple rather unpleasantly of clear nail varnish. Most peculiar, she murmured to herself, though she was careful to keep her observations private for the moment. Lady Bantry, meanwhile, had engaged Mrs. Jackson in conversation about the morning's events. "I noticed you straightening the display earlier," Dolly was saying. "So thoughtful of you to help Mrs. Carr with the preparations." Mrs. Jackson's response was perhaps a shade too quick. "Oh, just minor adjustments. I tightened something that seemed to wobble. One does want everything to appear at its best for such an important demonstration, Miss..." Marple filed this information away carefully. Mrs. Jackson had had access to the wheel before the demonstration began. "Interesting, Dr. Haddock," completed his preliminary examination and stood up, brushing dust from his knees. "Clear case of asphyxiation," he confirmed to Inspector Slack. The scarf tightened around her throat with considerable force. Death would have occurred within minutes. As the crowd began to disperse according to Mrs. Jackson's instructions, Miss Marple took the opportunity to examine Mrs. Armitage's scarf more closely. The silk was of excellent quality, as one would expect from someone of her position, but as Miss Marple gently touched the hemmed edge, she noticed that several of the thread ends felt oddly tacky, almost as if they had been treated with some kind of wax or adhesive substance. Most unusual, she reflected quietly. Agnes Pottle, overhearing, sniffed dismissively. Nothing unusual about it. Proper silk always has a bit of texture to it, not like these modern synthetic things. But Miss Marple wasn't entirely convinced. In her long experience of fabrics and their properties, silk thread ends shouldn't feel quite so sticky, particularly not on a garment that was obviously well cared for and expensive. Inspector Slack was beginning to establish a timeline of events, questioning each witness about their precise whereabouts and observations. The general consensus seemed to be that this was indeed a tragic accident, the sort of thing that could happen when clothing and machinery came together in unfortunate combination. Yet Miss Marple found herself oddly unsatisfied with this explanation. Perhaps it was nothing more than her naturally suspicious nature, developed over years of observing human behavior in all its complexity. But the three small details she'd noticed, the unusual brake band, the incorrectly positioned hook, and that telltale glossiness on the tension knob, seemed to suggest that this might not be quite the simple accident it appeared to be. She glanced around the assembly rooms, noting the positions of the various participants, the timing of events, and the small but potentially significant details that others might overlook in their shock and grief. Mrs. Carr was still sobbing quietly, supported by several sympathetic ladies. Agnes Pottle continued to hold forth about the foolishness of county people. Mrs. Jackson moved efficiently about her duties, though Miss Marple couldn't help noticing that her hand shook slightly as she gathered up the scattered knitting patterns. And somewhere in the careful choreography of this terrible morning, Miss Marple suspected lay the truth about what had really happened to Mrs. Millicent Armitage at the spinning wheel. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices a Shiny Band. Assembly rooms had taken on an oddly hushed quality in the hour following the tragedy. Inspector Slack had cordoned off the Heritage Corner with official efficiency, though he permitted Dr. Haddock to continue his examination of the scene. The remaining fairgoers clustered in small groups, speaking in lowered voices and casting frequent glances toward the spinning wheel that had become the center of such unexpected drama. Miss Marple had positioned herself on one of the wooden chairs near the refreshment table, where she could observe the proceedings without appearing to interfere. Her knitting bag sat primly on her lap, though her needles remained idle as she watched the various participants with her characteristic quiet attention. Lady Bantry approached with 2 cups of tea, her expression troubled. "I've spoken with poor Mrs. Carr," she reported, settling into the adjacent chair. "The dear woman is quite beside herself. She keeps insisting that the wheel was properly adjusted. And what exactly does that mean, my dear? Miss Marple inquired gently, accepting her tea with a grateful nod. Well, according to Mrs. Carr, she had set what she calls the double drive quite loose, and the Scotch tension was nearly off altogether. Apparently, this should have made the wheel pull very gently on any fiber fed into it. Dolly lowered her voice further. She simply cannot understand how it could have grabbed Mrs. Armitage's scarf with such terrible force. Most illuminating, Miss Marple replied, sipping her tea thoughtfully. And has anyone examined the wheel itself since the accident? Oh, Inspector Slack has forbidden anyone to touch it until his investigation is complete, though I did notice you studying it rather intently earlier. Indeed, Miss Marple had been studying it, and what she had observed continued to trouble her considerably. The three anomalies she had noted seemed to grow more significant the more she considered them. Dr. Haddock approached their table, his medical bag in hand and his expression grave. Ladies, I've completed my preliminary examination. Death was certainly by asphyxiation, as I suspected. The scarf tightened with remarkable force around her throat. How terrible, Lady Bantry murmured. But surely it was simply a dreadful accident. These old machines can be dangerous if one isn't careful. Dr. Haddock frowned slightly. That's what puzzles me, actually. I've observed Mrs. Carr's demonstrations before, and she's always most particular about safety. The wheel should have been set to draw very gently, not with a kind of force that could... He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the details. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. Dr. Haddock, I wonder if you might permit me a closer examination of the wheel itself. I have some small experience with spinning, and I confess I'm rather curious about the mechanical aspects. The doctor glanced toward Inspector Slack, who was questioning Mr. Tupper about the morning's events. I suppose there would be no harm, provided you're very careful not to disturb anything. Miss Marple rose with the sort of quiet determination that those who knew her well had learned to respect. She approached the cordoned area with the measured pace of someone accustomed to observing details that others might overlook. The spinning wheel stood exactly as it had been left after the tragedy, its wooden surfaces gleaming in the afternoon light. Miss Marple bent slightly to examine the brake band that controlled the flyer's tension, careful not to touch anything with her hands. Her suspicions were confirmed immediately. The band was not cotton twine, as one would normally expect, but rather a length of clear monofilament line. When she leaned closer, she could detect a faint but unmistakable scent of lake water, the sort of smell that clung to fishing. Equipment. Most interesting, she murmured to herself. Moving her attention to the mother of all, the wooden beam that carried both the flyer and bobbin assemblies, she noticed two tiny droplets of what appeared to be clear varnish, positioned precisely where someone's hand would naturally grip when adjusting the tension knob. Dr. Haddock, she called softly, might I borrow your magnifying glass for a moment? With the enhanced vision the glass provided, Miss Marple could see that the brake band was indeed fishing line, probably of quite light test weight, but strong enough to grip with considerable force when under tension. Unlike cotton twine, which would slip gradually under extreme stress, monofilament would bite and hold. A cotton brake will slip kindly under pressure, she observed aloud, more to organize her own thoughts than to inform her companions. This would bite and hold with no give whatsoever. Lady Bantry had followed her friend to the cordoned area, her curiosity overcoming her natural reluctance to intrude. Jane, what exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet, my dear, merely observing. But Miss Marple's tone carried an undertone that Dolly had learned to recognize over the years of their friendship. Inspector Slack, having concluded his interview with Mr. Tupper, approached the little group with his characteristic brisk authority. Now then, Miss Marple, I trust you're not interfering with official police business. Oh, certainly not, Inspector. I was simply admiring Mrs. Carr's beautiful wheel. Such craftsmanship in these old pieces. Slack grunted, but seemed satisfied that Miss Marple was merely indulging her well-known interest in domestic artifacts. He turned his attention back to Dr. Haddock. Doctor, I'll need your official report as soon as possible. Seems straightforward enough, but we must follow proper procedures. As the inspector moved away to continue his inquiries, Miss Marple took the opportunity to examine one final detail that had caught her attention. One of the flyer hooks, the small metal guides that directed thread onto the bobbin, was positioned incorrectly, its opening facing into the direction of the incoming strand rather than away from it. She studied the hook more carefully and detected a minute file mark on its curved surface, as if someone had deliberately sharpened it to catch more effectively. On the orifice edge of the wheel, she noticed a small tuft of Angora fiber caught in the wood grain. Agnes Pottle's work, Lady Bantry observed, following Miss Marple's gaze. Half the shawls in the competition are made with Angora. Lovely fiber, but it does shed terribly. Miss Marple nodded absently, though she couldn't help thinking that the presence of Angora fiber at this particular spot was rather too convenient. In her experience, when clues presented themselves so obviously, they often served to misdirect attention from more significant details. Agnes Pottle herself had been watching the examination from across the room, and she approached now with her characteristic forthright manner. "I suppose you're thinking that bit of Angora points to me," she said with a defiant tilt of her chin. "Well, you'd be wrong if you are. Half the work in this room sheds Angora, and I've been sitting at that speed knitting demonstration the whole morning. Ask anyone." "I'm sure that's quite correct," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Angora is indeed a challenging fiber to work with cleanly. But privately, she reflected that Agnes Pottle's defensive response was precisely what she might have expected from someone who had noticed the fiber and understood its potential implications. Whether those implications were significant remained to be determined. Dr. Haddock completed his notes and prepared to leave. "I'll have the complete report ready by tomorrow morning, Inspector. Though, as I said, the cause of death is quite clear." As the official examination concluded and the crowd began to thin, Miss Marple found herself more convinced than ever that the three anomalies she had observed, the monofilament brake line, the reversed and sharpened hook, and the clear coating on the tension knob, were not coincidental. Someone had prepared this wheel very carefully indeed, and Mrs. Millicent Armitage's death was no accident at all. Chapter 4. The Hook Against the Twist. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the assembly rooms, casting long shadows across the now subdued gathering. Most of the fairgoers had departed, leaving only those directly involved in the morning's events, and a handful of the more determined gossips, who seemed reluctant to abandon such a promising source of village drama. Miss Marple had retreated to a corner table, ostensibly to organize her knitting supplies, but in reality to observe the remaining participants with her customary discretion. The revelations of her examination had crystallized her suspicions into something approaching certainty, though she was far from ready to voice her conclusions aloud. Agnes Pottle had positioned herself near the blocked shawls, maintaining a protective vigil over her prize entries while engaging anyone within earshot in animated discussion of the morning's tragedy. Her voice carried clearly across the room. "Mark my words, there's something not right about this whole business," she declared to Mrs. Wilson from the post office. "I've been around spinning wheels since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and they don't just grab people like that. Not when they're properly set," Mrs. Wilson murmured appropriately. Sympathetic responses while casting, nervous glances toward the cordoned heritage corner. But surely Mrs. Carr would know how to adjust her own wheel correctly? Of course she would. Lena Carr's forgotten more about spinning than most people ever learn. That wheel of hers is gentle as a lamb when it's set right. Agnes lowered her voice conspiratorially. No, if you ask me, someone's been tampering. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she continued her methodical stitching, but her attention was entirely focused on this exchange. Agnes Pottle might be blunt to the point of rudeness, but her knowledge of traditional crafts was undeniably extensive. Inspector Slack emerged from his interview with the Reverend and Mrs. Clement, his notebook tucked away, and his expression suggesting bureaucratic satisfaction with a case nearing closure. He approached the Heritage Corner once more, studying the spinning wheel with the air of a man confirming already formed conclusions. Straightforward enough, he announced to Dr. Haddock, who had remained to assist with the official proceedings. Tragic accident, of course, but these old machines can be unpredictable. One moment of carelessness with loose clothing, and he gestured vaguely at the wheel, clearly ready to conclude his investigation. Miss Marple found this haste rather premature given what she had discovered, but she knew better than to challenge Inspector Slack directly. The man had little patience for what he termed amateur interference. Mrs. Carr approached the inspector with hesitant steps, her eyes red from weeping, but her voice steady with conviction. Inspector, I truly must insist that the wheel was properly adjusted. I checked everything twice before the demonstration. The double drive was slack. The Scotch tension was barely engaged. It should have been quite safe. Slack consulted his notebook with punctilious attention. Yes, well, Mrs. Carr, in situations of stress, people sometimes remember things differently than they actually occurred. No doubt you intended to set it safely, but perhaps in the excitement of the moment. I did not make a mistake, Mrs. Carr replied with quiet dignity. I have been spinning on that wheel for 30 years. I know every adjustment by feel. Miss Marple found herself in complete agreement with Mrs. Carr's assessment. The evidence she had observed suggested that the wheel had indeed been deliberately modified, and not by someone whose intention was to ensure a safe demonstration. Lady Bantry returned from the refreshment area with a fresh pot of tea and settled beside Miss Marple with the air of someone settling in for a lengthy consultation. Jane, you've been terribly quiet. I can practically see the wheels turning in that clever head of yours. I've been thinking about hooks, my dear, Miss Marple replied, her tone deceptively casual. Specifically about how they're meant to function, and what happens when they're turned the wrong way. Hooks? Whatever do you mean? Miss Marple set down her knitting and turned to face her friend directly. On a spinning wheel, the flyer hooks are positioned to guide the thread smoothly onto the bobbin. They face away from the incoming strand, you see, so that the fiber flows past them naturally. But if one were to reverse a hook, to turn it so that its opening faces into the thread path? She paused, allowing Dolly to consider the implications. It would catch things, Lady Bantry said slowly. Like a fishhook, precisely. And if someone had taken the trouble to file that hook to a sharper point, it would catch even more effectively. The two ladies contemplated this information in thoughtful silence. Across the room, Agnes Pottle had moved on to instructing Mr. Tupper about the proper care of antique wooden implements, while Mrs. Jackson continued her methodical tidying with the sort of determined efficiency that suggested she preferred action to contemplation. But Jane, Lady Bantry said eventually, even if someone did tamper with the wheel, how could they have known that Mrs. Armitage would be the one caught by it? Surely such a trap would be indiscriminate in its victims. This was indeed the crux of the matter, and Miss Marple had been considering it carefully. Tell me, Dolly, what do you remember about Mrs. Armitage's behavior during the judging? Any particular habits or patterns you might have noticed? Lady Bantry frowned in concentration. Well, she was very methodical about examining the entries, and she had that little row counter on her knitting needle that she kept checking. I remember thinking how organized she was, always pausing at the same count and then doing one more row before moving on. The count was 9, I believe. Yes, that's right. She'd stop at 9, then say something about one more and continue. Rather a charming habit, actually, Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A habit observed by others would be a habit that could be anticipated and exploited. Someone who knew Mrs. Armitage well would understand her patterns and could time their actions accordingly. "And the handbell?" she murmured more to herself than to Lady Bantry. "I beg your pardon?" Mrs. Jackson rang the handbell to signal the beginning of the demonstration. If I recall correctly, Mrs. Armitage was at precisely the right point in her routine when she heard it. 9 stitches counted. Time for one more, and then movement to the spinning wheel. The implications were becoming increasingly clear. Someone had orchestrated not just the mechanical trap, but the timing that would ensure Mrs. Armitage was the victim. This required intimate knowledge of her habits and careful coordination of events. Dr. Haddock passed by their table on his way to speak with Inspector Slack, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to pose a question that had been troubling her. "Doctor, in your examination of Mrs. Armitage, did you notice anything unusual about her scarf? Any signs that it might have been treated with some substance that would make it more likely to catch on things?" Haddock paused, clearly surprised by the question. "Treated? What sort of treatment do you mean?" "Oh, perhaps a coating of some kind. Something that might make the fabric more sticky or prone to snagging." The doctor considered this carefully. "Now that you mention it, I did notice that the fabric seemed to have an unusual texture near the edges, rather tackier than one would expect from pure silk, but I attributed it to the trauma of the accident." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though I wonder if it might be worth examining more closely." As Dr. Haddock moved away to join Inspector Slack, Miss Marple reflected on the growing pattern of evidence. The wheel had been deliberately sabotaged, with fishing line, a sharpened hook, and some sort of coating on the tension adjustment. Mrs. Armitage's scarf had been treated to make it more likely to catch. The timing had been carefully orchestrated to ensure she was the victim. This was no accident, but a carefully planned murder, executed with the sort of domestic cunning that Miss Marple had encountered all too often in her long experience of village life. The question now was not whether Mrs. Armitage had been murdered, but by whom and why. Chapter 5, Row Counter at 9. The late afternoon shadows had begun to lengthen across the assembly rooms when Miss Marple made her way quietly to where Mrs. Armitage's personal effects had been carefully gathered by Inspector Slack. Among the items was the small row counter that had been clipped to the deceased woman's knitting needle, its brass surface gleaming dully in the fading light. The little device was a marvel of simple engineering, designed to help knitters keep track of their progress through complex patterns. A small dial showed numbers from 0 to 99, advanced by pressing a tiny button with each completed row. Mrs. Armitage's counter showed the number 9. "Fascinating little gadgets, aren't they?" Dr. Haddock observed, having noticed Miss Marple's interest. "My late wife had one very similar. She was always clicking away at it during her evening knitting sessions." "Indeed they are," Miss Marple agreed, studying the counter with particular attention. "And this one tells quite a story, I believe." "What sort of story, Jane?" Lady Bantry, who had been watching her friend's investigation with growing curiosity, moved closer. "The story of a woman of very precise habits," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. Mrs. Armitage was clearly someone who found comfort in routine and predictability. 9 stitches, then a pause to consider, then one more row before moving on to the next task. She glanced around the room, noting the positions of various witnesses. Mrs. Jackson was still supervising the cleanup with characteristic efficiency, while Agnes Pottle continued her vigil near the competition entries. Mrs. Carr sat quietly in a corner chair, still pale with shock but no longer weeping. "Dr. Haddock," Miss Marple continued, "you mentioned observing Mrs. Armitage during the judging. Did you notice her consulting this counter regularly?" The doctor nodded. "Oh yes, quite methodical about it. She'd examine an entry, count her stitches, check the counter, and then move along. Very systematic approach to both knitting and judging, I'd say." Miss Marple found this confirmation significant. A habit so pronounced that casual observers would notice it was a habit that could be exploited by someone with malicious intent. "Lady Bantry," she ventured, "you seem to be suggesting that someone deliberately planned to... But surely that's impossible. How could anyone have known she would be at exactly the right moment?" "An excellent question, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "But consider the sequence of events. Mrs. Jackson rang the handbell to signal the beginning of the demonstration. Mrs. Armitage, having just reached her habitual pause point, would naturally have concluded her current task and moved toward the spinning wheel. The timing was quite precise. Inspector Slack, who had been completing his paperwork at a nearby table, looked up with evident irritation. "Miss Marple, I hope you're not suggesting that this was anything other than a tragic accident. The evidence is perfectly clear." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of contradicting your investigation, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with her most innocent expression. "I was merely observing how regular dear Mrs. Armitage was in her habits. Such a methodical person, but privately, she was becoming increasingly convinced that those very habits had been used against the unfortunate woman. Someone had observed Mrs. Armitage closely enough to understand her patterns, then exploited that knowledge to ensure she would be in precisely the right place at the critical moment. The question remained, who possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to orchestrate such a plan?" Mrs. Jackson approached their group, her organizational clipboard still in hand despite the tragic circumstances. "Inspector, I believe we've completed the necessary tidying. Will there be anything else required this evening?" "I think we've covered everything adequately," Slack replied, clearly eager to conclude the matter. "Tragic accident, but these things happen with old machinery. And careless handling." Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Jackson's relief at this pronouncement seemed rather more pronounced than mere administrative satisfaction might warrant. The woman's hands were no longer trembling, as they had earlier, and her color had improved considerably. "Mrs. Jackson," Miss Marple ventured conversationally, "you rang the handbell to signal the demonstration, didn't you? Such perfect timing to gather everyone's attention." "Yes, we always maintain a precise schedule for these events," Mrs. Jackson replied, though her tone carried a slight defensiveness. Mrs. Armitage appreciated punctuality. She often mentioned how much she valued organizations that ran according to proper timetables. Another piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Jackson would have known Mrs. Armitage's preferences and habits better than most, given her role as coordinator of WI events. She would have understood the woman's methodical nature and could have predicted her response to the handbell signal. Agnes Pottle, who had been listening to this exchange while folding her competition entries, snorted with characteristic bluntness. "Punctuality is all very well, but there's something to be said for common sense, too." Anyone with eyes could see that Mrs. Armitage was the sort to go poking about near machinery. Should have warned her properly about loose scarves. "I'm sure Mrs. Carr gave adequate warnings," Lady Bantry protested mildly. "She's always so careful about safety." "Of course she is," Agnes agreed, "which makes it all the stranger that something went so wrong, doesn't it?" Miss Marple found Agnes's observation quite astute. Mrs. Carr was indeed known for her cautious approach to demonstrations, always emphasizing safety precautions and proper procedures. For such a tragic accident to occur under her supervision seemed genuinely anomalous. Mrs. Carr herself overheard this discussion and approached with hesitant steps. "Keep thinking about the wheel," she said quietly. "Something felt different when I tried to stop it. The treadle seemed to respond oddly, and the tension mechanism wouldn't release as quickly as it should have. Shock can affect one's perceptions, Inspector Slack observed dismissively. In moments of crisis, mechanical devices often seem to behave differently than we expect. But Miss Marple found Mrs. Carr's account entirely credible. A woman who had operated the same wheel for 30 years would certainly notice any deviation from its normal behavior. If the tension mechanism had been deliberately sabotaged with that clear coating she had observed, it would indeed respond more slowly to emergency adjustment. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a coherent picture. Mrs. Armitage's predictable habits, the precisely timed handbell signal, the mechanical modifications to the wheel, and the treated scarf, all pointed toward a carefully orchestrated murder rather than a tragic accident. As the gathering finally began to disperse in earnest, Miss Marple reflected on the psychology behind such a crime. The murderer had displayed considerable cunning in exploiting Mrs. Armitage's methodical nature, but they had also revealed their own intimate knowledge of both the victim's habits and the mechanical workings of a spinning wheel. Moreover, the crime required someone with access to the wheel before the demonstration, someone trusted enough to make helpful adjustments without arousing suspicion, and someone familiar enough with WI procedures to coordinate the timing effectively. The circle of possible suspects was narrowing considerably, though Miss Marple was far from ready to voice her conclusions. There were still crucial pieces of evidence to uncover, and in her experience, premature accusations often allowed the guilty party to escape justice through careful destruction of incriminating materials. And as she gathered her knitting supplies and prepared to depart, Miss Marple cast one final glance at the Heritage Corner, where Mrs. Armitage had met her end. Tomorrow, she suspected, would bring further revelations about this carefully planned crime disguised as a village accident. Chapter 6. Fishing Line in the Raffle Hamper. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, with a sort of February brightness that made even the most mundane village activities seem touched with possibility. Miss Marple had spent a restless night, considering the various elements of the previous day's tragedy, and she rose early with the firm intention of pursuing certain lines of inquiry that had occurred to her during her wakeful hours. Her first destination was the assembly rooms, where she hoped to examine the scene once more before Inspector Slack's investigation was officially concluded. She arrived to find the building unlocked. Mrs. Jackson, having already begun the task of restoring the hall to its normal configuration. Miss Marple. Mrs. Jackson exclaimed with surprise, looking up from where she was dismantling the heritage display. I wasn't expecting anyone quite so early. I thought I'd make a start on clearing away the fair materials before the cleaning ladies arrive. How thoughtful of you, my dear, Miss Marple replied warmly. Such a burden of responsibility you carry, ensuring everything returns to proper order. I do hope you don't mind if I retrieve my reading spectacles. I believe I may have left them near the refreshment area yesterday. This was not entirely truthful, as Miss Marple's spectacles were safely in her handbag, but it provided an excellent excuse for a thorough examination of the premises. Mrs. Jackson waved her toward the refreshment tables with distracted courtesy. Her attention focused on carefully packing away the antique spinning implements. Miss Marple made her way past the dismantled stalls and folded tables, noting how efficiently Mrs. Jackson had organized the cleanup operation. The woman was clearly someone who took pride in administrative competence, the sort of person who anticipated problems and prepared solutions in advance. The raffle hamper sat near the platform, still filled with donated goods, awaiting collection by yesterday's winner. It was a substantial wicker basket that Ernie Jackson had contributed from their cottage, lined with cheerful gingham fabric, and containing an assortment of homemade preserves, knitted items, and small household luxuries. Miss Marple approached the hamper with casual interest, as if merely admiring the generous donations, but her experienced eye was searching for something quite specific, and she was not disappointed in her quest. Tucked beneath a jar of Mrs. Pottle's award-winning blackberry jam, almost invisible against the gingham lining, lay a short length of clear monofilament fishing line. It was perhaps 6 inches long, cut with what appeared to be sharp scissors, and bore the same faint scent of lake water that she had detected on the brake band of the spinning wheel. "How interesting," she murmured to herself, carefully noting the line's position without disturbing it. Near the fishing line, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small metal file of the sort used for sharpening hooks and maintaining tackle. When she leaned closer, she could see fine, clear shavings clinging to the file surface, evidence of recent use on metal objects. "Find your spectacles, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Jackson called from across the room, her voice carrying a note of polite inquiry. "Not yet, I'm afraid," Miss Marple replied cheerfully. "But I'm so enjoying seeing all these wonderful raffle prizes. Such generosity from the village families." She moved away from the hamper, having seen what she needed to see, and continued her ostensible search while pondering the significance of her discovery. The fishing line and file in Ernie Jackson's hamper could hardly be coincidental, given the mechanical modifications that had been made to the spinning wheel. Mrs. Jackson approached, wiping her hands on a cloth after handling the dusty display materials. "I do hope we can locate your spectacles. Perhaps they fell behind one of the tables." "Oh, I'm sure they'll turn up," Miss Marple assured her. "Tell me, did your husband help with the setup yesterday morning? Such a lot of work for one person to manage alone." "Ernie always lends a hand with the heavy lifting," Mrs. Jackson replied, though Miss Marple detected a slight tension in her voice. "He brought the raffle hamper over from our cottage the night before, and he helped arrange some of the displays, though he's not much for the delicate work, of course." Miss Marple nodded understandingly. "Men do tend to be rather all thumbs with fine adjustments, don't they? Though I suppose some have more practical skills than others. Doesn't Mr. Jackson enjoy fishing? I seem to recall seeing him by the pond occasionally." "Yes, he's quite keen on angling," Mrs. Jackson confirmed, her tone becoming slightly defensive. "Nothing wrong with a man having a hobby, is there? He's always mending his tackle and organizing his equipment. Very methodical about it, actually." The defensiveness was telling, Miss Marple reflected. Mrs. Jackson seemed to anticipate criticism of her husband's activities, which suggested she might be concerned about how those activities could be interpreted in light of recent events. "Certainly not," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Such hobbies require considerable skill and patience. I imagine he's quite knowledgeable about different types of fishing line and their various applications." Mrs. Jackson's response was perhaps a fraction too quick. "Oh, I wouldn't know about the technical details. That's entirely his department. I leave him to his fishing matters while I handle the household organization." But even as she spoke, Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Jackson's gaze flickered briefly toward the raffle hamper, suggesting she was quite aware of what her husband kept in his tackle collection and where various items might be stored. The sound of footsteps outside announced the arrival of other early visitors. Lady Bantry entered with her characteristic brisk energy, followed somewhat reluctantly by Inspector Slack, who clearly preferred to conduct his investigations without civilian observation. "Jane!" Lady Bantry exclaimed. "I might have known I'd find you here bright and early. Any luck with your spectacles?" "I'm still searching, I'm afraid," Miss Marple replied, maintaining her fiction, while privately noting that Inspector Slack was eyeing the cleaned heritage corner with satisfaction. The man seemed quite ready to consider the case closed. "Well, I suppose we should let Mrs. Jackson continue her excellent work," Slack announced with bureaucratic finality. "Clear case of accidental death, properly documented. Investigation complete. No need to prolong the disruption to village activities." Miss Marple found this conclusion rather premature given what she had just discovered in the raffle hamper, but she understood that Inspector Slack was not particularly receptive to suggestions about prolonged investigations. The man preferred straightforward cases with obvious explanations. "Inspector," she ventured mildly, "I don't suppose you examined the raffle donations yesterday. Sometimes people include rather surprising items in their contributions." Slack looked puzzled. "Raffle donations? Why would I examine those? They're just village contributions for the fundraising." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed, "though one does occasionally find interesting items that might shed light on local activities and interests." She allowed her gaze to rest meaningfully on the hamper, hoping that Lady Bantry at least might understand the implication. Her friend was often quite perceptive about such hints. Lady Bantry indeed seemed to catch the subtle suggestion. "How fascinating, Jane. Perhaps we should examine the donations more carefully. I'm always curious about what people choose to contribute to community events." But before they could pursue this line of inquiry further, Mrs. Jackson had moved decisively to the hamper and began efficiently transferring its contents to a smaller basket. "I'll just organize these for Mrs. Fletcher to collect," she announced. The winner was so pleased to have won such lovely prizes. Miss Marple watched with interest as the fishing line and file disappeared beneath. Layers of jam jars and knitted goods. Mrs. Jackson's haste to reorganize the hamper suggested she understood exactly what Miss Marple had been seeking and was determined to prevent further examination. The medium. Morning's discoveries had confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the true nature of Mrs. Armitage's death, but they had also made clear that gathering additional evidence would require considerable discretion and patience. Chapter 7. Varnish on the tension knob by mid-morning. Miss Marple had excused herself from the assembly rooms and made her way to the village high street, where a number of small errands provided excellent cover for her continuing investigation. Her first stop was Fletcher's chemist, where she hoped to pursue a particular line of inquiry that had occurred to her during her examination of the spinning wheel. Mr. Fletcher, a thin, precise man who had dispensed medicines and sundries to St. Mary Me for the better part of 30 years, greeted her with his customary courtesy. "Miss Marple, how pleasant to see you. I trust you're keeping well despite yesterday's dreadful events. Such a shock for the entire village." "Indeed it was," Miss Marple replied, "though I must say your shop window display of nail preparations has quite caught my attention. Such an array of modern products for the well-groomed lady." Mr. Fletcher beamed with professional pride. "Yes, we do try to stock the latest preparations. Clear varnishes are particularly popular just now. They provide protection without the boldness of colored lacquers." "How sensible," Miss Marple agreed. "I don't suppose you recall any recent purchases of clear nail varnish. I'm considering a small gift for my great niece, and personal recommendations are so much more valuable than mere advertisements." The chemist consulted his sales ledger with the methodical care of someone who took pride in accurate record-keeping. "Let me see. Mrs. Jackson purchased a bottle of crystal clear just last week. She mentioned it was for a special occasion. And young Susan from the post office bought a similar preparation for her wedding preparations." Miss Marple absorbed this information with careful attention. Mrs. Jackson's purchase of clear nail varnish, combined with the evidence she had observed on the spinning wheel's tension knob, was becoming quite significant indeed. "How thoughtful of Mrs. Jackson to prepare for the fair so carefully," she observed mildly. "Such an organized person, always ensuring everything appears at its best." "Oh yes, Hilda Jackson is quite particular about appearances, takes great pride in her responsibilities with the Women's Institute." After completing her ostensible errand at the chemist, Miss Marple made her way to the rectory, where she found Griselda Clement tending to her small garden, despite the February chill. The vicar's wife looked up from her early bulbs with pleasure. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you. I've been thinking about yesterday's terrible accident all morning. Poor Mrs. Armitage and poor Mrs. Carr, too. She must feel dreadful about what happened." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, settling onto the garden bench that Leonard Clement had installed for just such conversations. "Tell me, my dear, you were standing quite close to the Heritage Corner during the demonstration, weren't you? Did you happen to notice anything unusual about the spinning wheel itself?" Griselda frowned thoughtfully, clearly trying to recall specific details from the traumatic events. "Well, I remember thinking how beautifully maintained it looked. Every surface gleaming, all the brass fittings polished to perfection. Mrs. Carr had obviously taken great care with the presentation. And did you observe Mrs. Jackson making any adjustments to the display before the demonstration began?" "Oh, yes, she was most helpful. I saw her near the wheel earlier, doing something with one of the mechanical parts. She said something about tightening a component that seemed loose. Very thoughtful of her to assist. Mrs. Carr with the technical preparations, this confirmation of Mrs. Jackson's access to the spinning wheel before the fatal demonstration was exactly what Miss Marple had hoped to establish. The woman had clearly been in a position to make the subtle but deadly modifications that had transformed a gentle demonstration into a murder weapon. Did you happen to notice what time this adjustment took place?" "It must have been around 11, just before the judging concluded. I remember because the church bells had just finished chiming the hour." The timing was significant. Mrs. Jackson would have made her preparations immediately before the demonstration, ensuring that her modifications would not be discovered by Mrs. Carr during any preliminary checks of the equipment. Griselda continued her recollections, warming to the subject. "I must say, Mrs. Jackson seemed rather nervous about the whole event. Her hands were quite unsteady when she was adjusting the wheel, and she kept checking her watch. I attributed it to the natural anxiety of organizing such an important occasion." Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Jackson's nervousness might have had rather different origins than organizational anxiety. The woman had been preparing to commit murder, a prospect that would understandably affect even the most composed individual. As she walked back toward the village center, Miss Marple encountered Lady Bantry emerging from the post office with her daily correspondence. Her friend's expression brightened immediately. "Jane, perfect timing. I've just heard the most interesting gossip from Mrs. Wilson. Apparently there's some question about the Women's Institute accounts. Nothing serious, I'm sure, but there seem to be some irregularities that require attention." This information struck Miss Marple as potentially very significant indeed. Financial irregularities could provide powerful motives for desperate actions, particularly if exposure threatened someone's reputation and standing in the community. "How unfortunate," she replied thoughtfully. "I don't suppose Mrs. Wilson mentioned who might be responsible for investigating such matters." "Oh, that would be Mrs. Armitage's responsibility. She served as the county representative for financial oversight. Apparently, she had scheduled a review of the local accounts for this week. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with increasing clarity. Mrs. Armitage, in her official capacity, would have had both the authority and the obligation to investigate any financial discrepancies in the local Women's Institute accounts. If Mrs. Jackson had been embezzling funds, exposure by Mrs. Armitage would have meant public disgrace and probable prosecution. "Most interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And I suppose such a review would examine all aspects of the organization's finances. Membership fees, fundraising proceeds, expenditures." "I imagine so." Mrs. Armitage was known for her thoroughness in such matters. She took her responsibilities very seriously. Lady Bantry paused, clearly considering the implications of this information. "Jane, you don't suppose there could be any connection between these financial questions and yesterday's tragic accident?" "One never knows, my dear," Miss Marple replied carefully, "though I've always found that money troubles have a way of complicating people's lives in unexpected ways." As they parted company, Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly to synthesize the various elements of evidence she'd gathered. Mrs. Jackson's purchase of clear nail varnish, her access to the spinning wheel immediately before the demonstration, her husband's fishing tackle conveniently available in the raffle hamper, and now the revelation of potential financial irregularities that Mrs. Armitage was scheduled to investigate. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Mrs. Jackson had both the means and the opportunity to commit the crime, and if financial embezzlement was involved, she certainly had a compelling motive. The woman had used her position as organizer to gain access to the murder weapon, her husband's fishing equipment to modify the wheel's mechanism, and her own cosmetic supplies to ensure the tension knob would not release quickly enough to save Mrs. Armitage's life. It was a plan that demonstrated considerable cunning and attention to detail, exploiting Mrs. Armitage's predictable habits and using domestic materials to create a death trap that would appear to be nothing more than a tragic accident. But Miss Marple was far from finished with her investigation. There remained the question of concrete proof, and she suspected that Mrs. Jackson, for all her apparent organizational competence, might have left additional evidence of her guilt in places where she felt secure from discovery. Chapter 8. The Ledger in the Teapot. Cozy the afternoon found Miss Marple returning to the assembly rooms under the pretext of helping with the final cleanup efforts. She had spent the intervening hours in careful consideration of her discoveries, and a particular theory had begun to form regarding where Mrs. Jackson might have concealed evidence of her financial irregularities. The hall was nearly restored to its usual austere functionality, with only the refreshment area remaining to be thoroughly cleared. Mrs. Jackson was supervising this final phase, with her characteristic attention to detail, directing the removal of tablecloths and the washing of crockery, with the sort of precision that had made her indispensable to village organizations. "Miss Marple," she called, out with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "How kind of you to offer assistance, though I think we have everything well in hand." "I'm sure you do, my dear," Miss Marple replied warmly. "But I noticed yesterday that you had such lovely tea cozies on display. I've been thinking of making one for my nephew's wife, and I wondered if I might examine the construction techniques more closely." This request seemed to catch Mrs. Jackson slightly off guard, though she recovered quickly. "Oh, the tea cozies. Yes, several of our members contributed them for the display. I believe most have already been packed away." "How disappointing," Miss Marple said with gentle regret. "I was particularly interested in that charming gingham one that was used during the refreshment service. Such neat stitching around the edges." Mrs. Jackson's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple caught it nonetheless. "I believe that particular cozy belongs to the hall's regular equipment. It's probably still in the kitchen area." Miss Marple smiled gratefully and made her way toward the small kitchen adjoining the main hall. The space was cramped but efficiently organized, with shelves of mismatched crockery and the sort of practical equipment that accumulated in community buildings over the years. The gingham tea cozy sat on a shelf, near the large brown teapot that was traditionally used for serving at village functions. It was a cheerful domestic item, hand-sewn with obvious care, and designed to keep the tea warm during lengthy social gatherings. But as Miss Marple lifted the cozy to examine its construction more closely, she discovered that it concealed something far more significant than mere teapot. Warmth tucked inside the fabric cavity was a small leather-bound ledger, the sort used for keeping detailed financial records. The ledger's pages revealed a careful accounting of Women's Institute finances, with columns for membership fees, fundraising proceeds, and various expenditures. But several entries had been modified with different ink, and a pattern of discrepancies became apparent to Miss Marple's experienced eye. Small amounts had been systematically diverted from various fundraising activities over the past several months. The individual sums were modest enough to escape casual notice, but they accumulated to a substantial total that would certainly have attracted attention during any thorough audit. More damning still was a folded letter tucked between the ledger's pages, written on official county stationery and bearing Mrs. Armitage's precise signature. The letter was dated just 3 days earlier and requested a complete review of the local accounts, citing certain irregularities that required immediate investigation. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing certainty about the motive behind Mrs. Armitage's murder. The letter made clear that Mrs. Jackson's embezzlement had been discovered and that exposure was imminent for someone who had built her entire social identity around organizational competence and trustworthiness. Such disgrace would have been unbearable. Miss Marple? Mrs. Jackson's voice carried a note of concerned inquiry from the main hall. Are you finding everything you need in there? Oh, yes, thank you, Miss Marple called back, carefully replacing the ledger within the tea cozy exactly as she had found it. Such a beautifully made piece. The workmanship is quite exceptional. She returned to the main hall with the appearance of satisfied curiosity, though her mind was racing with the implications of her discovery. Mrs. Jackson had chosen her hiding place with considerable cunning, selecting a location that was both completely accessible to her and utterly mundane in appearance. Did you find inspiration for your nephew's wife? Indeed I did. Such clever needlework techniques. I'm particularly impressed by the attention to practical details. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Jackson with new understanding. The woman's efficiency in organizing the cleanup was matched by her careful attention to removing any evidence of the previous day's events. She supervised the washing of every piece of crockery personally and ensured that all linens were properly laundered before storage. It was the behavior of someone who understood the importance of eliminating traces of her activities, though Miss Marple suspected that Mrs. Jackson's primary concern was concealing her financial crimes rather than evidence of murder. The woman probably believed her mechanical sabotage of the spinning wheel had been too subtle to detect. Mr. Tupper, the hall's rent collector, appeared during the final stages of cleanup with his characteristic air of persistent grievance. He approached Mrs. Jackson with obvious reluctance, clutching a small notebook filled with careful notations. Mrs. Jackson, I really must speak with you about the rental fees. The account seems to be somewhat behind, and I haven't received the usual monthly payment for quite some time. Mrs. Jackson's response was perhaps a shade too emphatic. Oh, Mr. Tupper, there must be some confusion in your records. I'm certain all payments have been made according to schedule. Perhaps you should check your accounting more carefully. But Mr. Tupper was not easily discouraged when it came to matters of money owed. I've checked my records thoroughly. Mrs. Jackson, the last payment I received was in November, and we're now well into February. That represents a considerable shortfall. Miss Marple found this exchange illuminating. Mrs. Jackson's embezzlement had apparently extended to the hall rental fees, creating additional financial pressure that would have made Mrs. Armitage's investigation even more threatening. The conversation concluded with Mrs. Jackson's promise to review the matter and provide clarification within the week. But Miss Marple could see the strain in the woman's demeanor. The web of financial deception was unraveling, and Mrs. Jackson was clearly struggling to maintain her composure. As the cleanup concluded, and the various participants began to depart, Miss Marple reflected on the complete picture that had emerged from her investigation. Mrs. Jackson had been systematically embezzling funds from multiple sources, a crime that Mrs. Armitage was about to expose through her official review. Faced with inevitable disgrace and prosecution, Mrs. Jackson had planned and executed a murder disguised as an accident, using her organizational position to gain access to the weapon and her knowledge of the victim's habits to ensure success. The evidence was comprehensive: the modified spinning wheel, the fishing tackle from her husband's collection, the clear nail varnish used to sabotage the tension mechanism, and now the hidden ledger documenting both the embezzlement and Mrs. Armitage's intention to investigate. But Miss Marple understood that gathering evidence and proving guilt in a court of law were two very different challenges. She would need to proceed with considerable care to ensure that justice was served for Mrs. Armitage's murder. Chapter 9. Platform. The treadle set to kill the evening sky had deepened to a soft violet when Miss Marple made her way back to the assembly rooms for what she suspected would be the final act of this village tragedy. She had sent word to Inspector Slack, Lady Bantry, and Dr. Haddock, requesting their presence for what she diplomatically termed a clarification of yesterday's events. Inspector Slack arrived first, his expression suggesting considerable irritation at being summoned for what he clearly considered an unnecessary reopening of a closed case. "Miss Marple, I do hope this won't take long. The matter is quite straightforward, and I have other pressing duties to attend to." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with her most conciliatory manner. "I simply thought you might find it interesting to review certain details that have come to light since your investigation concluded." Lady Bantry entered with Dr. Haddock close behind, both wearing expressions of curious concern. The doctor carried his medical bag, though Miss Marple hoped his professional services would not be required this evening. Mrs. Jackson was the last to arrive, having been specifically invited to discuss certain organizational matters related to the Women's Institute accounts. She appeared composed but alert, her handbag clutched tightly and her eyes darting nervously between the assembled group. Miss Marple had arranged 4 chairs facing the platform, where a speed knitting demonstration had taken place, creating an informal but purposeful setting for her revelations. The spinning wheel remained in its corner, now draped with a protective cloth, but still radiating an ominous presence. "I'm grateful you could all spare the time this evening," Miss Marple began, settling into her chair with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to conducting village meetings. "I believe we have been rather hasty in accepting yesterday's tragedy as a simple accident." Inspector Slack shifted impatiently. "Miss Marple, the evidence was perfectly clear. Mrs. Armitage approached the spinning wheel carelessly. Her scarf became entangled and the machinery did the rest. Tragic, but hardly mysterious. Indeed, the mechanics of her death were exactly as you describe," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "But I think we must examine whether those mechanics occurred by accident or by design." She rose and moved toward the heritage corner, drawing back the cloth to reveal the spinning wheel in all its polished complexity. This beautiful machine was carefully prepared for murder. Inspector, someone with considerable knowledge of both its operation and Mrs. Armitage's personal habits, transformed it into a deadly trap. Mrs. Jackson's face had grown noticeably pale, but she maintained her composure with admirable determination. "Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting that someone deliberately caused this terrible accident?" "I'm afraid I am suggesting exactly that, my dear." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but her words carried unmistakable conviction. "The evidence is quite comprehensive once one knows what to look for." She began her demonstration with the brake band that controlled the flyer mechanism. "Dr. Haddock, would you be so kind as to examine this band with your magnifying glass? I think you'll find it rather different from what one would normally expect." The doctor complied, studying the mechanism with professional thoroughness. "Good heavens, this isn't cotton at all. It appears to be some sort of clear filament, fishing line, I'd say." "Precisely. Monofilament fishing line, which grips with tremendous force rather than slipping gradually like cotton twine would." Mrs. Carr set her wheel for a gentle demonstration, but someone had secretly replaced the brake band with material that would bite and hold with deadly efficiency. Inspector Slack was beginning to look more attentive despite his initial skepticism. "And you're suggesting someone made this substitution deliberately?" "Indeed I am. Moreover, I found the source of this fishing line." Miss Marple gestured toward where the raffle hamper stood. "Yesterday morning, before the evidence could be properly examined, I discovered a cut length of identical monofilament in the raffle hamper contributed by the Jackson household, along with a small file bearing clear shavings from recent use." Mrs. Jackson's composure finally began to crack. "That proves nothing. Ernie keeps all sorts of fishing equipment around the cottage. Anyone could have taken something from his tackle box." "Quite true," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "But there are other modifications to consider." She indicated one of the flyer hooks, which Dr. Haddock examined under his magnifying glass. "This hook has been reversed," the doctor observed with growing amazement. "And there's a file mark where someone has sharpened it. It would catch anything that brushed against it." "Exactly. And notice the small amount of Angora fiber caught on the orifice edge. I suspect that was placed there deliberately to suggest that Mrs. Pottle might have tampered with the wheel. A rather obvious red herring, since Angora sheds constantly and could have come from any of the entries in the competition." Lady Bantry was following the demonstration with fascination tinged by horror. "But Jane, how could anyone have known that Mrs. Armitage would be the one caught by such a trap?" Miss Marple smiled sadly. "Because the trap was designed specifically for her, my dear. Observe this tension knob, which Mrs. Carr tells us was set quite loose for safety. Someone coated it with clear nail varnish so that it would not release quickly under emergency pressure." She produced a pin from her handbag and demonstrated how the sticky varnish prevented the knob from turning smoothly. In a crisis, when Mrs. Carr tried to release the tension quickly, this deliberate sabotage would have delayed her response by precious seconds. Inspector Slack was now examining the evidence with genuine interest. "And you believe Mrs. Jackson applied this varnish?" "I do indeed. Mr. Fletcher at the chemist confirms that Mrs. Jackson purchased clear nail varnish just last week. And I noticed yesterday that she had a bottle of crystal clear in her handbag, with one bristle bent and gummy from recent use on a rough surface." The case was building inexorably, but Miss Marple had saved the most damning evidence for last. But perhaps most significant of all is the question of motive. "Mrs. Jackson, would you care to explain the financial irregularities in the Women's Institute accounts?" The accusation struck home with devastating effect. Mrs. Jackson's careful composure finally shattered completely, and she slumped in her chair as if the weight of discovery had become physically unbearable. "Mrs. Armitage was scheduled to conduct her county review this week," Miss Marple continued remorselessly. She had already discovered discrepancies and had written to request a complete audit. For someone who had built her entire reputation on organizational trustworthiness, exposure as an embezzler would have meant utter ruin. Mrs. Jackson's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper. "It was only small amounts, just temporary borrowing to cover household expenses. I meant to replace it all before anyone noticed." "But Mrs. Armitage did notice," Miss Marple observed gently, "and she was going to expose your theft. So, you used your position as organizer to access the spinning wheel, your husband's fishing equipment to modify the mechanism, and your own nail varnish to ensure the tension knob wouldn't release. You timed the demonstration to coincide with Mrs. Armitage's habitual pause at 9 stitches, knowing she would approach the wheel at exactly the right moment." The confession that followed was halting, but complete. Mrs. Jackson had indeed embezzled funds over several months, always with small amounts, but accumulating to a sum that would have meant prosecution and imprisonment. When Mrs. Armitage's letter arrived announcing the audit, desperation had driven her to murder. "I only meant to frighten her," Mrs. Jackson whispered through her tears. Just a warning that she should be more careful about interfering in local affairs. I never intended for it to be fatal, but Miss Marple knew better. The elaborate preparation, the multiple fail-safe mechanisms, and the deliberate timing all pointed to a carefully planned murder, not a mere warning gone wrong. Inspector Slack performed his duty with grim efficiency, and Mrs. Jackson was led away to face the consequences of her crimes. As the assembly rooms fell silent once more, Miss Marple reflected on how domestic cunning and village knowledge could be turned to such dark purposes. Chapter 10. Afterward. Plain wool, plain truth. 3 weeks had passed since the dramatic events at the assembly rooms, and St. Mary Me had begun to settle back into its familiar rhythms. The scandal of Mrs. Jackson's arrest had provided the village with enough conversation to last well into spring, though the initial shock had gradually given way to the sort of resigned acceptance that rural communities develop when confronted with human frailty. Miss Marple sat in her comfortable sitting room on a particularly gray February evening, her fingers working steadily through the rows of a plain gray cardigan she was knitting for her great-nephew. The wool was good quality, but unremarkable, and she found comfort in the simple repetition of knit and purl stitches after the complexities of recent events. Lady Bantry had arrived for tea, bringing with her the latest news from the village grapevine, and her own characteristic blend of curiosity and sympathy for all concerned parties. "I've just come from visiting poor Mrs. Carr," Dolly announced, settling into her favorite chair with a grateful sigh. "She's finally agreed to bring out the spinning wheel again, though she's having it thoroughly checked by an expert craftsman before she'll consider any more demonstrations." "Very sensible of her," Miss Marple observed, not looking up from her knitting. "Though I suspect the wheel itself bears no blame for what happened. It was simply a tool like any other, that was perverted from its proper purpose." Lady Bantry helped herself to a slice of seed cake and considered this philosophical observation. Mrs. Carr mentioned something rather touching. She said that Mrs. Armitage had been planning to learn spinning herself. Apparently, she'd spoken about taking lessons once her county duties became less demanding. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment. "How very sad. One always imagines there will be time for such peaceful pursuits, doesn't one?" Mrs. Armitage seemed like someone who would have enjoyed the meditative aspects of traditional crafts. The evening newspaper lay folded on the side table, its headlines dominated by larger concerns than village scandals. But buried on the third page was a brief notice, reporting that Mrs. Hilda Jackson had been sentenced to 7 years imprisonment for embezzlement and murder. The Riki judge had noted the premeditated nature of the crime while acknowledging the defendant's previously unblemished character. "I can't help feeling rather sorry for poor Ernie Jackson," Lady Bantry confessed. "The man had no idea his fishing tackle was being used for such purposes. He's taken it very hard, apparently. Blames himself for not noticing that things were missing from his equipment. Guilt by association is a terrible burden," Miss Marple agreed gently. "Though I suspect Mr. Jackson's real anguish comes from realizing how desperate his wife must have been to contemplate such actions. Sometimes we live alongside people for years without truly understanding the pressures they carry." The Women's Institute had moved quickly to address the financial irregularities, appointing a temporary treasurer, and implementing new oversight procedures. The missing funds had been repaid through the sale of the Jacksons' cottage and personal effects, though the damage to the organization's reputation would take much longer to heal. "Agnes Pottle has been asked to take over the secretary's position," Lady Bantry reported with a slight smile. She accepted, but only after delivering a lengthy lecture about proper financial controls and the importance of village people handling village affairs. Miss Marple chuckled softly. "I'm sure she'll prove very capable," Mrs. Pottle may be forthright to the point of rudeness, but her honesty is absolute. The Institute will be in good hands. As the evening deepened, their conversation turned to broader reflections on the case and its implications. Lady Bantry had been puzzling over various aspects of the crime, trying to understand how someone as respected as Mrs. Jackson could have fallen so far. "What I find most disturbing," she mused, "is how methodically she planned it all. This wasn't a crime of passion or sudden desperation. She must have been thinking about murder for days, working out every detail." Miss Marple continued her steady knitting, the gray wool flowing through her experienced fingers with mechanical precision. "I think that's exactly what made it possible for her to contemplate such an act. By focusing on the practical details, the fishing line, the varnish, the timing, she could avoid confronting the moral reality of what she was planning. Rather like following a recipe for disaster instead of acknowledging she was taking a human life." "Precisely. My dear, Mrs. Jackson was an organizer by nature, someone who solved problems through careful planning and attention to detail. When faced with the threat of exposure, she simply applied those same skills to the problem of eliminating Mrs. Armitage. The parallel between domestic competence and criminal planning was one that Miss Marple had encountered before in her long observation of human behavior. The same qualities that made someone an excellent housekeeper or committee member could, under sufficient pressure, be turned to darker purposes. "I keep thinking about that poor wheel," Lady Bantry said with a shudder. "Such a beautiful old thing, reduced to an instrument of death. Will Mrs. Carr ever be able to use it normally again? Do you think?" "I believe she will," Miss Marple replied with quiet confidence. "Mrs. Carr understands that the wheel itself was innocent. It was human hands that corrupted its purpose, and human hands can restore it to its proper function. Time and use will eventually wash away the stain of what happened." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds being the soft click of Miss Marple's needles and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. The gray cardigan was taking shape with satisfying regularity, each row building upon the last in predictable progression. "Jane," Lady Bantry said eventually, "how did you know to look for financial motives? What made you suspect that Mrs. Jackson's crimes went beyond simple accident?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "It was the attention to detail that first aroused my suspicions. The modifications to the wheel were too numerous and too precise to be coincidental. Someone had invested considerable thought and effort into ensuring Mrs. Armitage's death would appear accidental." She paused to count stitches before continuing. "But more than that, it was Mrs. Jackson's behavior afterward. She was too eager to tidy things away, too quick to redirect attention from certain evidence. In my experience, innocent people don't usually feel compelled to hide things unless they have other secrets to protect." The investigation had reinforced Miss Marple's long-held belief that most crimes, however elaborate their execution, ultimately sprang from simple human motivations: greed, fear, pride, or desperation. Mrs. Jackson's case had involved all four, creating a volatile mixture that had led to tragedy. As Lady Bantry prepared to depart, she cast one final glance at Miss Marple's methodical knitting. "That's going to be a lovely cardigan. So perfectly even, every stitch exactly where it should be." Miss Marple smiled and held up her work to examine the evening's progress. "Knitting is rather like life, don't you think? The pattern itself is usually quite simple. Knit one, purl one, increase here, decrease there. But it's the small adjustments that determine whether you create something beautiful or something flawed. The little choices that people make?" Exactly. Mrs. Jackson could have confessed her financial difficulties and faced the consequences with dignity. Instead, she chose deception, then escalation, then murder. Each choice seemed logical at the time, but together they created something monstrous. As her friend departed into the cold February night, Miss Marple returned to her knitting with renewed appreciation for its honest simplicity. The gray wool might be unremarkable, but there was beauty in its straightforward purpose and function, unlike the elaborate deceptions that had led to Mrs. Armitage's death. The cardigan would serve its intended purpose without pretense or hidden agenda. Plain wool, plain truth, she murmured to herself as her needles resumed their steady rhythm. In a world where domestic skills could be perverted into instruments of murder, there was something deeply comforting about work that remained true to its essential nature. The village would heal as villages always did. New scandals would eventually eclipse this one, and Mrs. Jackson would become merely another cautionary tale whispered among the tea tables. But the lessons of the case would remain. That respectability could mask desperate crimes, that familiar tools could serve unfamiliar purposes, and that the difference between creation and destruction often lay in the smallest of adjustments to well-established patterns. Outside, St. Mary Me settled into another peaceful night, its secrets temporarily exhausted, and its conscience temporarily at rest.